Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gaia Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is supported by Uniting Mission and Education, part of the Synod in New South Wales and ACT, and I thank them for their support. My guest today is Jon Butler. Jon, welcome along to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
For those who don't know, Jon Butler is Howard R. Lamar Professor Emeritus at Yale University and Research Professor of History at the University of Minnesota. His books include Los Angeles Times bestseller Becoming America, the prize-winning Awash in a Sea of Faith, and The Huguenots in America. He is the past president of the Organization of American Historians. And today we are talking about his book, God in Gotham, The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan, out now with Harvard University Press. You can pick that up wherever you pick up books, and I definitely recommend picking it up, and this interview, I'm sure, will show you why. So, Jon, let's just, for those who are interested, let's get this what got you interested in this topic of exploring religion in New York in the Gilded Age? What kind of started that itch to explore that?
Well, it started really from teaching. So at Yale, when I was a teacher, I taught a big lecture class, 100 or so, 120 students, on American religion from the Civil War to the present. And I had trouble explaining what happened to American religion from roughly the 1880s to the 1960s, because the standard way to do that is to really stress secularization. That is to say, things weren't really so great. And yes, there was the social gospel for Protestants in the main. But, basically things sort of went to hell in a handbasket. And, it hasn't been so great ever since. The difficulty with that, of course, is that the facts that's not the way the facts lined up. That is, how is it that you could think of it this way? Where did we get Jerry Falwell from? In other words, if everything was so dismal from the 1880s into the 1920s, the Depression, whatever, where did Jerry Falwell come from? And I wrote an article a long time ago now called Jack in the Box History. It was as though Jerry Falwell was a kind of Jack in the Box who just popped up out of nowhere, almost nowhere, because after all, religion had been in decline. So where did he come from? So that really started me on this. I had a difficulty explaining what was going on here. Then there are two other things that really inclined me to say, well, then the question is, well, why didn't I write a book on America? Why didn't I write a book on Manhattan or New York City as a whole, but at least on Manhattan? Why didn't I write a book about America? Well, two things. One is I grew up in rural Minnesota in a farm town. My dad was a commuting farmer, and I grew up in a town of 1,000 people and had a high school class of 36. And we took a senior class trip in 1958 to Washington, D.C. and New York. Now, when we went to New York, of course, we didn't go to Queens. We didn't go to Brooklyn. We didn't go to Staten Island. We went to Manhattan. Of course, that's New York. That's what you think about it, New York. Yeah. And I really have never forgotten that. It was just so thrilling, so captivating for someone from that kind of a town. I never gave it up, and so when I moved, ultimately I took a job at Yale and 70 miles away, and I love to go to the city, so why not write about New York? And then moreover, why not write about New York? Because it's generally thought to be, it's oftentimes described as the capital of American secularism. That is, when you go to Manhattan, you don't think about Jesus, all right? You don't think about religion. You don't think about, if you thought about it a little bit, if you gave it a little more thought, you think about Times Square, okay? And then if you look at Times Square, there isn't much there that would make you think, oh yes, these people are really pious. These people are really, they're secret they're not so secret worshipers. They're really, that's what they are. And even if you took all the tourists away, okay? So you could say, oh, the tourists are all evangelicals, but New Yorkers, Well, that's not what people think. And even when they walk by, they sort of walk by St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is the biggest biggest sanctuary in the city, and always has been. I mean, it has been ever since it was built. And so they peek in non-Protestants, non-Catholics peek inside. So Jews and Protestants peek inside, and the Catholics go in, and the brave Jews and the brave Protestants go in, but only the brave ones. And but they don't. They go in, and then they keep walking, and then they think about spending some more money, and that's what they do. So that's what I thought. And then it happened that my closest friend of many, many years was someone that I knew from graduate school at the University of Minnesota. And he ended up being, very quickly became he was an urban historian, and he ended up as distinguished professor of urban history at UCLA. And sadly, he died in 2005. But he and I and our families would spend all summers in Minneapolis. So we would come back here all summer long. And we lived a couple blocks away from each other then. And we both had 2 boys, and we shepherded them around to first wading pools and ultimately to basketball camps. So over 20 some years. And we talked history all summer. And I learned urban history by talking to him. So if I put the 3 together, that is the intellectual problem, my fascination for Manhattan, and my association with Eric Munkanen, that's who we're talking about here. That's how I honed in on Manhattan. That's why I wrote such a book. Why shouldn't I write? At first, I was going to write a book on the whole city, New York City, and that lasted about, I don't know, I think that lasted about a year. And then I realized, I have to finish this book in my lifetime, and I really can't do this. I can't do the whole city. There's no way I can do the whole city. So then, I could have picked Brooklyn, which was it was described in the 19th century as a city of churches. So that's when Brooklyn was an independent city. But what fun would that be? Why wouldn't, that's not going to solve my problem. My problem is really the secularism problem. So I honed in on Manhattan, and I decided to get rid of all the other boroughs, and I honed in on Manhattan. And that's how I came to write this book. And it took me much longer than I thought it was going to take. And part of that is because the research was so much fun. I had so much fun doing the research, I couldn't get around to doing the writing, whatever. And besides, for historians, most historians have every day you research, you have a great day. You always find something. Doesn't make any difference what it is, even if it's not on your topic, you'll find something that's interesting. But that's not true when you write. so that's not the way writing goes. It doesn't necessarily work that way. I think most writers would tell you that. So the writing is the hard part. The research is the easy part, except it takes a lot of time.
Yes.
But anyway, I did finally finish it, and here it is, and there we have it.
Yes. No, that's great. Thank you for that. And as you say, yes, there's definitely a lot of really interesting stuff to find, and we'll dive into a bit of that. I guess you said there's this key narrative that exists of this like secularization, dampened, squashed religion in this time, and that one of the main factors in that was modernity was this factor that was going to make no one's going to be religious because of modernity, or there'll be small pockets of it, but it can't be this thing that flourishes. And I guess a key part of your book is that it's not despite of modernity. Like this narrative of religion in Manhattan is not kind of, I guess, like with shields and battalions, they fought back modernity and found a way for religion to survive. It was through modernity, because of modernity, utilizing a lot of what came with modernity, and even, as you'll say, also urbanization, utilizing those actually to transform and to so that religion would actually flourish in that time. So can you talk to us a little bit about this, because I think that's often, again, it's one of those narratives that abides, and your book is kind of showing maybe not so
well,
much.
As much as I love reading Max Weber, the great German sociologist, he was wrong about this famous pronouncement that he made in 1917 in a speech in Munich, in which he discussed the disenchantment of the world. The world was becoming disenchanted. It was becoming disenchanted by modernity. And that means bureaucratization, that meant urbanization, that meant the rise of science, scientific explanation, so many of the things, and by urbanization, that also means density, that how could religion survive? Religion was really well suited to face-to-face communities, but it wasn't well suited, he thought, to these massive urban spaces where nobody knew each other, people didn't watch each other, they didn't pay attention to each other, they didn't know who they were, they didn't know what they believed, they didn't know what weird behaviors they were engaged in. Well, they might know some of them, but there wasn't much they could do about it. And he discussed the disenchantment of the world. And that phraseology has become just, you run into it everywhere. It goes on everywhere. Now, there are two difficulties with Weber. One is that he died very soon thereafter of pneumonia. He was dead by 1920. I think he died in 1920. He was only, I think, 56. And he never really filled out what he meant by that. He wrote books on Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism, and whatnot, but those were earlier. He didn't write the book that he seemed to be in the market to write on the disappearance of religion amidst modernity. That book was never written. He died. So everybody sort of leaned on, they tried to pick out this phrase about the disenchantment of the world and then pick it apart as best they can. But there isn't much from Weber that they can use because he didn't fill it out. And the one for me, I didn't even realize this when I started. I didn't know at the beginning when I started that Weber had actually come to America and he'd spent several weeks in New York City. He came to America in 1904 to give a big talk at a huge social science conference in St. Louis. And he toured the country. He went down to Tuskegee. He saw a Black service in Washington, D.C. He went up to upstate New York to see some German immigrant settlements. And then he ended up in New York City, spent 2 weeks there. And the main thing that he did in New York City was to go to church services. And he went. He sort of we know about that largely because of his wife's diaries or his wife's notes. And we know that they went to a Christian Science service, which he thought was really boring, very boring. And they also went to an ethical culture service, which is either religious or not religious, depending on how you want to view the ethical culture movement. And he thought that Felix Adler, who was the head of the science, he was also boring. They didn't realize that she wrote this in her book, and they didn't realize that they were going to be at a dinner with him the same night she wrote this, and so they had to suffer through a dinner with him. Maybe they didn't have to suffer through a dinner with him. Anyway, maybe it was a little embarrassing when she wrote that he was boring, but they had to go to a dinner with him. They weren't impressed, and she also wrote down that Weber really thought that the churches were being displaced by the settlement movements. That is largely either settlement houses or the YMCAs, or ultimately the YHCAs, Young Hebrew Men's Association, or the Women's Association, or the Young Christian YWCA, YMCAs and YWCAs. What he didn't really realize is that happened to be the period in which the Y movement itself was very Christian. I mean, they were serious about sort of implementing the social gospel through the YMCAs. They weren't like they might be now. If I go to my Y in St. Paul, Minnesota, I don't hear much about Jesus. I don't. Everybody wants to know, is the weight room ready or something like that. That's what they want to know about. They don't want to know about religion. But in 1904, the Y movement was really very religious, but Weber didn't really realize that. He saw them as a very secular kind of thing. He thought that the churches specifically were being, that's the phrase he didn't, he really meant Protestant churches. That seems pretty clear. And he didn't discuss Judaism. He didn't discuss synagogues, but in any case, he just didn't think that they were, he thought they were secular and they were being displaced. Churches were being displaced by these secular things. Then my point is that if he had come back, if he had lived, and if he had come back 1920, I think he would have been astonished. He would have been astonished by the growth in the number of, the pure number, growth in the number of sanctuaries in Manhattan alone would have been phenomenal. Between 1900 and 1920, 150, 200, 250 sanctuaries go up. And some of them are Catholic, some of them are Protestant, and some of them are Jewish. Because this is also the great age in which Jews turned from very tiny congregations, meeting in apartments, to fairly large scale synagogues. And it was the second generation that built the larger, most of the larger synagogues. There had been large synagogues built in the 19th century, but those numbers were dwarfed by those that were built between 1895 and 1920, even 1930. Weber would have been astonished by that alone, much less if he had attended services and saw the numbers of people who were flocking to all these services. So, whereas he thought the world was being disenchanted, you would have were you going to tell all these people flocking into Catholic services or Protestant services, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, whatever they are, Black services everywhere? You'd say, don't you know that the world is being disenchanted? What are you doing here? Why don't you go out and enjoy yourselves and just forget about all this spiritual stuff? The world is disenchanted, and you have to realize that. Well, I don't think they would have been, if you had told them that, I think they would have been, they would have said, no, that's not why, that you're wrong. I'm here to worship, I'm here to do it. And so the question is, well, how did this occur? How did they? Well, my point is that most of these groups embrace the tools that modernity provided. And what were those tools? Well, if they were interested in building sanctuaries, among other things, they embraced tools of the real estate business. Every one of these groups became experts in property management, buying and selling, acquiring lots, tearing down buildings, building sanctuaries. They did it in somewhat different ways. And the group that had the most centralized approach to this were Catholics. And they did this through the Archdiocese of New York, which was committed to very large scale parishes, meaning they would have sanctuaries that could seat 1,500, 2,000 people. And they would run so that they would run masses, 3, 4, and 5 masses on every Sunday, plus Saturday evening, from late in the afternoon on Saturday through the evening, so that they could handle the membership of anywhere from 5,000 to 9,000 parish members. And that's just counting adults, it's not counting children. So they could work them through these, and they would have 5 or 6 priests. So they needed to acquire big plots of land, and it's very clear that they did that. And they did that by buying up small pieces of property on the same block, and then tearing what ratty buildings were down, and then they would build these large-scale sanctuaries, and then you see them all over Manhattan. So it's not just, St. Patrick's was the biggest, but all these parish churches were very, very large. And then the idea would be every Catholic parish would have a school. So then they needed a school building. And one of the things that the book points out is that if you look at the parish, the sanctuaries all look like what you think a Catholic church looks like. But if you look at the school building, it looks like a New York City public school. That is, the architecture is very similar to a New York City public school. There isn't much difference between them. These I'm talking about the buildings built between roughly the 1880s and the 1930s. So they all have this very similar architecture. Well, you need to acquire land for the school. And ideally, the school is in the same block as the parish church. So you need to acquire more land. And usually the school came second. The school very seldom, I don't even know of a case in which it came first. Maybe there's one, but I don't know of any. The school came second. So the archdiocese has got all these people out buying property and acquiring it. And then they've got architects, and they did all the work for the parishes. Jews and Protestants did it largely on their own. Some Protestant denominations did give oversight and help to congregations that needed help, and that usually came in the form of finance. So it seems as though the Episcopal archdiocese seems to have done some of that. And some of the Methodists did that, but others didn't. And the Baptists usually didn't, but there are exceptions to that. But then Baptists had one great source for their mortgages, and that was John D. Rockefeller, the original John D. Rockefeller, who was a very loyal Baptist. And it's very clear from court records, because some of the congregations, we know that, not because it's hard to find these records, but some of the congregations would end up in disputes over their finances, and then they get into the court record, and it's in the court records that you discover, oh yes, John D. Rockefeller had financed this small Baptist congregation for $50,000. Well, $50,000 was a huge amount of money in 1895 or 1900. So they had some benefactors, and so the Jewish denominations provided no financial help whatsoever, and they provided very little other kinds of help with architecture. The Jewish synagogues were usually built entirely through the efforts of people getting together, second generation Jews from the big immigration of the 1880s. And they did it on their own. They hired their own architects. They did their own funding. They sometimes all of them got sometimes mortgages from savings and loan associations, but probably 50%, although this is very hard to figure out because the financial records haven't largely survived. But in any case, probably 50% or more of their financing for Protestants and Catholics came from individuals who contributed to a mortgage fund, and they would have sort of shares in the mortgage. So they would learn to do that. That's one of the things they did. The other thing they all professionalized the clergy. So the clergy increasingly had college degrees. They increasingly had fancy seminary degrees. They increasingly, the larger congregations went from one minister to two, and then 2 to 3, and 3 to 4. And sometimes the largest would have sort of professional Sunday school managers, people who learned how to do all this management. And they're developed from the 1880s forward a whole literature on professionalizing the management of congregations, professionalizing finances, professionalizing then how to give a good sermon. And then we have to learn how to do that, how to manage. Ultimately, by the 1920s, guess what comes in? How to be a psychologist. So that seminaries began to offer courses in psychology, modern psychology, because one of the things we do know anecdotally is that far more people went to their priest, their minister, or their rabbi to seek counsel for a marriage problem, for example, than ever saw a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And we know that from the records of the clergy. Yes. And so these clergy became very professionalized, and this professionalism is part of the development of modernity. So it's not something that, yes, occasionally people complained about it. And occasionally you have, it's sometimes historians, some especially maybe not so well-trained historians. I can think, I used to have a book on my bookcase back here about, it's a history of the Presbyterians, and the person complains about the professionalization of the denomination, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, the denomination largely succeeded because of this, and people, the congregants expected a professionalized clergy. They expected decent lessons in their Sunday schools. This is what they expected, and they wanted to know what was being taught in these Sunday schools, and what was the minister saying, or the rabbi saying, what was the priest saying. So all of this is to say that these groups, instead of rejecting modernity, and as you put it, riding into the 20th century on horses with shields, and as though this is a movie about the Crusades, and everybody, where they're all wearing armor. The armor that they wore was the armor of modernity. That's the armor that they wore. And if you want to say that they wore some kind of armor here and there, it's because they adopted the modern techniques of doing this and that. Now, that didn't mean that there weren't issues. And one of the reasons that the book contains a separate chapter on Blacks in New York, and it does, that traces Blacks in Manhattan from the Lower East Side to what was called the Tenderloin District, which is now Midtown. If you've been to New York, that's where Times Square is. That was originally called the Tenderloin District. It was originally a kind of a red light district, actually. And then to Harlem. So the Blacks moved to the Tenderloin because it was cheap. And they were sort of being priced out of Lower Manhattan, and then they had to move into the Tenderloin. And then when the Tenderloin began to develop as Midtown, they were priced out again. That is, especially by housing, even though they had all these nice, very nice sanctuaries. And their worshipers all had to migrate because they couldn't afford to live. They were overwhelmingly renters, and they couldn't afford to live in the old Tenderloin, which was becoming Midtown. And the one thing that the Black congregations did get out of being, in a sense, forced out of Midtown was they got huge prices for their churches. Because the churches were highly valuable, sat on valuable land, and all but what if you go to Midtown today, you will see no physical presence, Black presence, no memory of the former Black presence in Midtown at all, because every one of the congregations was demolished to become an apartment building or an office building. They were all demolished for that, and these congregations all moved to Harlem. So I tried to. That was my case study. I thought I could have written a case study on Presbyterians or Reformed Jews or whatnot, but I thought the case study that I wanted to write about was about Blacks, because it also illustrated the degree to which, despite the adoption of or maybe because of the adoption of modernity, part of modernity involves Jim Crow. Part of modernity involves prejudice against Blacks. Part of modernity involves the continuing, the never-ending, and actually the developing notions about Black inferiority and about segregation and whatnot. And that's part of the story here that I described. So that's what I did.
yeah. No, that's great. I think, and then that chapter is really helpful because, as you say, it's modernity brings brought all these opportunities, but also for the Black religious community brought those specific challenges and that push and that movement. And as you say, then there has to be this kind of flexibility in meeting in storefronts and things like that, and a bunch of other stuff has to be adapted to. And I guess also you kind of are talking a bit about the church's role in resisting or pushing back, or in early civil rights kind of that was developing too. There's that story too tied into what's going on there.
Well, part of the story that I wanted to, and I didn't really quite realize how true this would be. I also really discovered that from the very beginning, the Black clergy, wherever they were, in Lower Manhattan, in Midtown, or the Tenderloin, or then in Harlem, really tied their notion of Christianity to civil rights and to equal justice and to decency, the decent treatment of Blacks, the Christian treatment, because they were overwhelmed. I mean, they were overwhelmingly Protestant, and then meaning they were overwhelmingly Christian, because there was a relatively small Catholic presence among New York City Blacks. But they really were very forceful, and of course they weren't very successful in doing that. You know, they really. So I spent a fair amount of time describing the work of the Powells, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and then the Powell who's best known, unfortunately, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the congressman, and best known because of his later moral problems that he had when he was, after a number of years in Congress. You know, he squandered what he had been able to do for civil rights through his moral failures. But his father, Adam Clayton Powell, A.C. Powell, he was known as A.C. Powell. It wasn't known as Adam Clayton Powell then, but his son was known as Adam Clayton Powell. His father was really very adamant about civil rights, very, very, very adamant and direct and demanding. And he wrote a book at the end, after the riot, anti-Black riots in New York in the 1940s. He wrote a book. It was the final book that he wrote, and he really you feel the tiredness in the book that he had. He's talking about civil rights and about Christianity and about the failure of an overwhelmingly nominally Christian society to accept Blacks as equals in this society. And you can just feel the weight of all this history, you know, half a century in his lifetime, half a century or more of failure to really, really change the dialogue, change the facts. And that's I thought that was important to what I was doing when I was writing this book.
Yeah.
But at the end, so I discussed the suburbs, and so the suburbanization is interesting because you know, if you go to an American suburb, even now, we're 60, 70, 80 years away from the development of the suburbs in late 1940s, post-World War II suburbs. What do you see? Most people think of suburbs, the big shopping malls. But what predated the shopping malls? The spires. All of these suburban congregations all over the place. Long before there was a shopping mall, there were all these crazy congregations that they built up. And the question is, where do they come from? Well, what happened was that all these New Yorkers who wanted to move, and in other cities too, all these people who moved to the suburbs from the city, so fleeing the city, they wanted to reconstruct the vibrant congregational life that they had known growing up. So you get all these 30-year-olds, they want a Jewish congregation, they want a Protestant congregation, they want a Catholic parish, they want schools, etc. They want all of that. And that they weren't rejecting their religious training in the city. They were now going to have it prosper in the suburbs. And that's where this all comes from. That's where the proliferation of suburban American congregations. Now, there were critics of that who said, this isn't real religion, because all these people want to do is belong. That's all they want to do is belong. And there were a number, I describe a number of the critics who said, it's shallow. It's a shallow religiosity. They're really worshiping America. They're not really worshiping Jesus, or they're not really worshiping God or whatnot. But I think they missed the point. what were the congregations always about? The congregations were always about belonging, and the congregation serving as a entry point for people realizing what their faith means. And they can't realize what their faith means without belonging. Yes. That is, it's in the congregation, within the kind, it's in the life of the congregation that helps them realize, perfect their notions of how to treat people, how to think about religiosity, what's moral, what's ethical, what are we doing here? That all doesn't come from going out into the woods and speculating, rubbing up against trees and doing nature. It comes from getting together in these congregations, worshiping together, praying together, engaging in ritual together, and if you're doing bar mitzvahs or baptisms or whatever it is, that makes their faith live, and they need a congregation to do that. So this is what accounts that it's the effort to replicate what all these people have had in the city where Max Weber thought the world was being disenchanted. The city had given them these notions about what they should do, and when they fled to the suburbs because they didn't like, it was too crowded in the city or all this and that, too much crime, they thought, or whatnot. They wanted to perfect that in the suburbs. So you get a nice balance. So you get a nice balance from the 1880s when everybody's worrying about where is this religiosity going to survive? Everybody's worried. Protestants are worrying they're going to be buried by all the Catholics and Jews. The Catholics are worried because there's no government support for religion. They never had that. They always had that in Europe. And the Jews are worried because everybody, our people aren't going to live in face-to-face communities anymore, and they might not need their Judaism in this great big city anymore. So to the 1960s, when some people said we've got too much religion and it's too shallow. So you start in one place and you end in another, and ultimately that's where I think Jerry Falwell came from. In other words, there's this huge religiosity in America all over the place. Through up into World War II, and then after the war. Then I don't discuss this in the book but a fair amount of this stuff after the war gets tied into anti-communism and whatnot. But that's not a part of my book, so I don't. Other people have discussed that, and I'll let them.
Yeah.
In America, I'll let them run with that.
Yeah. I was curious. I was keen to talk about also about the chapter of God's Hothouse, and because you talk about the proliferation of public religious intellectuals, and tied to that is what you said before about the professionalization of clergy, which leads to the Jewish Theological Seminary, it leads to Union Theological Seminary, prominent places. So you've got your Reinhold Niebuhr's, your Paul Tillich's, your Abraham Joshua Heschel's, your Dorothy Day's, the Powells who you mentioned before, and a whole host of others of these figures who end up on time, right? Who host lectures that thousands of people come to. Again, that's when people think about going to New York now. You don't think, I'm going to pop in and see what the latest professor from Union is talking about, the ground of our being and the courage to be. That's not what we think people go to do there. So talk to us a bit about this. The proliferation of these figures, their impact on this story, and just a bit about what made that so possible.
Yeah. So, one of the other reasons I wanted to write about Manhattan is I thought, if I wanted to do a little bit on theology, a little bit, and I'm not, that's not my thing, but in any case, I wanted to do that. Well, where would you go? Let's say, forget if you just wanted to discuss where was all the intellectual action? Where was all theological action for the 20th century? And I see we have visitors, and that's great. Don't worry. I have grandchildren. I had children, so we don't need to worry about that. But if you wanted to do the theology thing, you'd say, "Hi, how are you? It's early in the morning. So you want to hear about Reinhold Niebuhr?" Okay, I bet you do. Okay. So, but if you wanted to if you wanted to do something and write a whole book on theology in 20th century America, what area would you go to? Well, you wouldn't go to the woods. You'd go to Manhattan. And that's not something that I think a lot of people originally thought about. They accept the fact that Niebuhr's in Manhattan, Tillich is in Manhattan, Heschel is in Manhattan, Abraham Kaplan is in Manhattan, Joseph Soloveitchik is in Manhattan, Dorothy Day is in Manhattan. Even the exiled, why am I blanking on his name? Jacques Maritain ends up being stuck in Manhattan, where he isn't stuck in Chicago. He could have decided to spend World War II in any American city, but he decided to spend it in Manhattan, where he was very, very active. And so that sort of sealed the deal for me, whatever another. I admit it also was the chapter that took me the longest to write, because I was the most nervous about writing, because I end up having to write 1,500 to 2,000 words on Reinhold Niebuhr. No, well, okay.
Yeah.
So, you could say, what is he going to say that's worth reading in 1,500 words? I mean, Niebuhr, there are, 7, 8 books already, 9 books on Reinhold Niebuhr, and every other book discusses Niebuhr for a chapter or something like that.
Yes.
Then there's Paul Tillich, and there are all these figures, Heschel and Kaplan and whatnot. They've all got, Dorothy Day, who's got several biographies. Every one of them, actually everybody except Joseph Soloveitchik has got a biography, and Soloveitchik needs one. So he's the leading figure for Orthodox Jews. Your Australian readers should know that, and he's very important. Well, I did my best. Let's just put it that way. It took me the longest because it took me the longest to research. It took me the longest to sort of really hone the chapters down. I'd start out with 3,000 words, and I had to chug them down to 1,500 or thereabouts, 1,800 words. I'm actually quite happy with what I wrote, and so far I haven't had a reviewer to say, "Oh, this is a bunch of bunk." So I felt lucky about that. So far people seem to have appreciated, I think, what I was trying to do, and that I'm trying to give a sketch of how it is that these figures transform the dialogue about the nature of religion in the nature of religion. And they happen to be located all in Manhattan, which is where you would not expect to find them. Why would you expect to find them? You'd expect to find them in a seminary located out in the woods someplace, in some isolated location where they can think and they can contemplate nature, and they could be at peace with God and whatnot. Well, no, they were at peace with God on Broadway. So
yeah.
They were perfectly fine, and riding the subway, they were at peace with God. They could figure that out. And that's what I tried to write about. And then at the end of that chapter, there are also all kinds of other figures. There's a Black woman who's raised from the dead, and she actually has a whole little denomination. And when I say she was raised from the dead, I'm not kidding. That is, she thought she was, or whatever. And she said, the trouble with, she was raised from the dead, she said, because she had so many congregational members that prayed for her return that she had to come back. When she was stuck coming back, they prayed her back into life. And that's what she said. It's what she believed. It's what her followers believed. So there were all kinds of people. I have a picture of a man whose name is not known, a white guy who's preaching in Harlem. And I love the picture that's in the book, because he's preaching he's set up on the street next to some movie posters. And you think, well, okay, so he's next to the movie posters because he catches the people who are there to look at the movie posters, but he can have some spiritual words while they're trying to figure out what kind of a movie in the late 1930s they want to watch. So you find these people all over the place, and not just these famous people, but people who are preaching all over the city in one way or another. And again, this isn't the Manhattan that you think you're that most people think about. They don't think about that part of Manhattan in the least. They think about Times Square, they think about movie theaters, they think about secularism, they think about high finance, most of which is corrupt. They think about banking, the stock market. That's what they think about. Well, that's true, but to hear where all these people who are thinking about that while they're worshiping, while they're attending services, while they're giving money to all these congregations. If you think about it, I never was able to calculate how much money would be contributed to religious organizations in a single calendar year, anytime between the 1880s and the 1960s. The amounts would have been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, would have been mind-boggling. And I wish I could think of a way to capture that, of simply saying how much money did people give? Well, they gave a lot. And that's how they got all this, that's how they paid these salaries, it's how they built these buildings, it's how they constructed all this stuff. They were engaged in high finance all the time.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. As you say, there's just so much, both the big and the small, throughout all this time. So I guess my final question, which maybe you have an answer for, maybe you don't, was, is there one thing you were just like particularly sad you had to leave out? Like one story, one figure, one little community that you were like, I really wanted to do this, but it couldn't make it, or maybe it couldn't make it in the form that you wanted. Maybe you were like, I wanted this to be a much bigger thing, and I had to just make passing reference.
Here's how I'll answer your question. I would have liked it if I could have written more about each of the chapters that I wrote. I would have liked it. It would have been fun for me as a historian, because I like the facts of things. To have written, to double the size of the chapter on the blacks, to double the size of I would like to have written more about our religious architecture. I would have liked to write more of these vignettes of the major theological figures in the city. I would have liked to have written 2 or 3 chapters on the suburbs. But the catch for a historian, I think, is that who's going to read that? And I thought, I decided in the end that I wanted a book that could be read. I didn't want a 600-page book, even though I think a number of people would have liked it better if I had written a 600-page book. But it's not what I wanted to do. It's not what I thought would be. I wanted to get the basic story out. And I'll leave it to others to decide, did I get anything right? Did I get some of it right? Did I get, a part, as I said, part of it right? Did I push the subject in the right direction? Maybe that's the main thing I wanted to do, is I wanted to push the subject in the right direction. I wanted to get away from, and the book is not meant to be praiseworthy of organized religion. It's not meant to be, it's not meant to be a proselytizing book for religion or Christianity or Judaism itself. It's meant to be a book that sort of says, here's what was going on. And if we want to discuss the demise of organized religion in the 20th century, we need to push a lot of that story much farther back into the 80s, the 90s, or the early 21st century. This is what I'm trying to do. So we've had a whole literature of when did religion all fall apart, So we have some historians, Brad Gregory at Notre Dame, it's got a book on so he thinks the end of the story started with the Reformation. He claims it's not an anti-Protestant book, but honestly it is. And he said, well, because magically, when did things start falling apart? 1500. Well, what happened around 1500? Oh, yes, Martin Luther. Okay, well, okay, 1517 or something like that. Okay, magically that's it. So we've had the Enlightenment, and that ruined everything. Okay, well, now we know, well, the 18th century, things didn't fall apart that badly in the 18th century. Yes, they did. So we had a pretty secular French Revolution, but then we got, got everything back sort of again. And then we've had everything fell apart in London and all the big British cities. So we've had that we've got a whole literature about that. But then, well, maybe yes, maybe no, whatever. So we keep having to push the story back. Yeah. And in America, we really have to say, I think I tried to say we need to push the story much, much, much toward the end of the 20th century. Because arguing for the demise of religion, Christianity, Judaism, Catholicism, and whatnot, all of these groups, if you take Manhattan, if you take Manhattan, or rural Minnesota where I grew up, if you take Manhattan or the rural Midwest, religiosity is thriving in the 1950s and 60s. It's just chock-a-block. You can't shut it down. And so the question is, well, then, Weber might have been right, but he was a century too soon.
Right. Yes.
Now, maybe he was right a century too soon. But now look at the 21st century. Here we are in the 21st century. So, and we've just gone through the pandemic, and we're still going through the pandemic. What's happened to religiosity? Well, all these congregations, I've done all these Zoom sessions with congregations about my book, and you get 150 people, 200 people tune into these things. And, okay, so they're doing the internet. They're doing religion on the internet. And that's how the American congregations are surviving this through Zoom.
Yeah.
And, now some of them will go back to in-person, in-house services. So that's what I would have liked to have written more, but the truth is I didn't want to write more. And I took some pleasure in trying to really make my book in a certain kind of way, have a certain kinds of density of compression, the density of compression that was comprehensible without people's eyes glazing over because I'm mentioning 600 different buildings or different. I would have liked more ministers. I mean, I've gotten some criticism of why didn't I include this rabbi, or why didn't I include this priest, or why didn't I include this minister, whatever. Well, I could have included a dozen more, but you can only include so many. So I thought you could only include so many and make it comprehensible. So that's what I was up to. That's the only thing. I put it this way, at my stage in life and at my stage in my career, I'm just glad the book is done. And that it's out there and that people can read it and they can pick it to death and they can say, we always should have done this, should have done that. But I did what I did, and I had a lot of fun doing it, maybe too much, which is in part why it took me a while to finish it. But it was fun to do, and I'm glad I did it. The one thing I really love to do is do the pictures. But when I submitted the manuscript, I had 92 photographs.
Oh, right.
And then my editor at Harvard said, John, you forgot that your contract calls for 40. So I had to cut them all down. And there are actually only 36. I think there are 36 that I included. But I love doing the pictures, and I'm really proud of the pictures that were included. Some of them are sort of weird, whatever. I like the one of Paul Tillich jumping. There's a famous picture of him jumping, and that was done by a weird photographer who did a book of famous people jumping, and Paul Tillich was one of them. And anyway, so I had fun doing. Or the Dorothy Day picture I got. Nobody else has used the one that I use. I found it through the web. I found it through an accident, and I loved that picture. I think that's great.
Well, the book is tremendous, and I think all those choices you made pay off because it's very readable, very a great narrative, and yes, as you say, I think it just opens the world for a lot of these someone can get fascinated by a figure and follow that down and give it its own treatment. But so the book is God in Gotham, The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan, out now at Harvard, and you can pick that up. And I really encourage folks to get it. It's really a fascinating read. Jon, thank you for joining us today on Love Is Repeat. Thank you for this conversation. It's been so wonderful. I'm sure everyone's learned a lot and excited to learn more by picking up the book and diving deeper in. Anything else you want to draw people's attention to? Anything else you want to promote this late stage in the game?
I really, it's so nice of you. I to speak for how many thousand miles apart we are.
Yes.
So I guess it's the one benefit of Zoom. And I was charmed to meet your daughter. Right?
Thank you. Yes.
So that's great, and you know, what a lovely time. So I really appreciate your interest in the book, and I wish you the best.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next week.